Okay, welcome back, guys, to my channel. And today we are going to be getting into a series I'm kicking off called The Big Four. Boom, boom. So, and I guess as the eager people you all are, you're anticipating what is the Big Four. So the Big Four is basically a series I'm kicking off where we're going to be looking four of the most exciting economies on the continent of Africa, but just largely based on the fact that they've received the most startup funding from venture capital investors. Particularly interesting to me because, you know, I enjoy the startup investment space, kind of at the intersection of technology and business and finance. So I participate a lot there, learning a lot there, and also kind of like trying to make a few deals kick off. Yeah, so on my newsletter, I break down ideas regarding technology, finance, business, culture, art. And one of the thoughts I had recently was just kind of on liquidity options for African startups. So the Big Four is me running through the top 4 African nations that receive the most startup investments and just kind of like looking through their economies and the investment landscape in those particular countries. The top 4 countries that received the most startup investment last year in 2022 was Nigeria in first place, second was Kenya, third was Egypt, and fourth was South Africa. So we're gonna go through them. And I did a poll and I just asked kind of like, which one would you want me to kick off with? And people voted Nigeria. So today we're going to be looking at Nigeria. But before we kick off, we have to do this one for the streets.
Say sitting in the corner, wearing Dolce & Gabbana. Our boys done harm.
Our boys, Nigeria, let's go. Let's go.
Crying out our soul. Never let you go, 'cause we know that it's so. Never let you go, we know that it's so.
Listen, if you know about this tune, you're connected, very connected. Okay, so I'm quite excited for the series, but obviously, you know, I'm British Nigerian. I'm Nigerian, you know, British Nigerian. I don't know what this means these days, but I'm Nigerian, you know. Like both my family from Southeast Nigeria, Imo State to be precise, or Imo State stand up. Yeah, we're just gonna be looking at Nigeria. Nigeria is a very interesting country to say the least. So as it stands in, so we're gonna do a quick overview, then we're gonna look at investment landscape, go through the strengths, weaknesses, then look at kind of the capital markets. So, you know, public markets and private markets, and then just do kind of like a quick speculation. I love the speculation parts, you know. I don't really have like a crystal ball, but like, yeah, just take a look at the future and see kind of future prospects of each country. Hope that makes sense. So let's kick off. So Nigeria is the most populous nation in Africa. It has a population as of 2022 of estimated to be around 217 million people. It's also a very young population from the estimates, and I keep saying the estimates because I don't think there's been a census that we can kind of like predictably rely upon in Nigeria for a while. And it's also expected to double by 2050, and by 2100 Nigeria will be the third most populous nation on earth behind India and China. Nigeria also has a very young population. So let's look at some of the strengths of Nigeria. So Nigeria is well endowed with physical resources. And so Nigeria is the largest economy in Africa. And by 2050, it's expected to be within the top 10 of all global economies. So it will be one of the 10 largest economies in the world. At this moment in time, Nigeria still relies quite heavily on petroleum. So crude oil extraction for its government revenue and foreign exchange. In terms of government revenues, making up to roughly about 80 to 85% of total government revenue came from resource extraction. And then when you double down on that, in particular, it was oil. But Nigeria also has large amounts of natural gas, coal, tin, and columbite. And columbite is an iron-bearing mineral that accompanies tin, so that comes alongside tin. So Nigeria does very, very well on a resource front and has benefited from it. Nigeria is also a member of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, and has been a member since 1971. The main oil refineries are in Port Harcourt, Warri, and Kaduna. Nigeria also possesses large reserves of coal, which are being developed gradually. I think one of the most interesting things from a resource extraction perspective, or just resources if we're looking at, is Nigeria's potential for solar. So Nigeria, out of the underutilized resources, solar energy probably is the highest, and Nigeria could look to, and to be fair, a lot of nations across Africa could look to see how they could leverage solar, especially as we transfer and transition quite quickly to a green world. Yeah, and then in terms of some of the issues that Nigeria faces, I think fundamentally, I think there's two main, and I think it's kind of like 1A and then 1B stems. And I think the first one is an underutilization of human capital, and the second is just the insufficient electricity generation, which kind of stems from the first one. So if we look at the first one in terms of underutilization of human capital, Nigeria is well endowed, immensely well endowed with both human capital in terms of actual people, actual numbers, and especially a young population, and also physical resources. But one of the major problems that has struck Nigeria is the fact that there hasn't been much progress in terms of, upskilling this population. So Nigeria has quite frequently had issues with kind of a lack of a skilled labor, so labor population. Labor population, but just of a lack of skilled labor supply. There's also been quite high levels of unemployment, especially youth unemployment. Youth unemployment in the last 10 years has increased by 10%, right? Which is now kind of like teetering at 19.5, 20% youth unemployment. And that's just kind of like estimates, if we're being super honest. Sometimes from some of the people I speak to on the ground, they say it's a lot higher than actually that number might present. So that's the main issues. Whilst in terms of socio-economic development, especially since kind of like the introduction of kind of more formal forms of democracy after kind of like a checkered history in the like later half of the 20th century with military dictators, Nigeria has definitely seen some levels of socio-economic development, but largely lags behind kind of like most world indicators. So here it says that its human capital development ranked 150 out of the 157 countries in the World Bank's 2020 Human Capital Index. And the country needs to find ways to diversify from its dependency on oil and address major infrastructure in particular regions, especially kind of like outside of Lagos and Abuja. Abuja being the federal capital territory and the capital of Nigeria, and Lagos being kind of like the main financial hub. Still large swathes of population outside of those two regions, and maybe Port Harcourt as well to a considerable extent. Major infrastructure needs to be addressed and desperately needs to be introduced, and build effective and strong institutions, as well as address kind of both obviously the governance and the public financial management situation. Nigeria has long been plagued with history of corruption and malpractice. So in order to kind of like instill trust, that definitely needs to be sorted out and managed. Another issue that I mentioned is the insufficient electricity generation that takes place in Nigeria. So Nigeria's economic growth is always going to be constrained by insufficient electricity generation. There are numerous economics that point to the fact that countries with larger amounts of electricity generation and electricity supply to their population tend to do better economically than those that don't. And you can see that that's just for a myriad of reasons, right? It's hard for you to build a company if there's no light. And I think just sorting out the electricity generation will make a whole world of difference for the Nigerian economy. Okay, so let's look at the capital markets analysis. We're going to start with public markets and then transfer over to the private markets. So public markets, here putting on screen for you guys the top companies by market capitalization in Nigeria. So you've got Dangote Cement, which is a non-energy material enterprise based in Lagos and is active across various countries. So that's still the largest company in Nigeria by market capitalization, roughly $11.2 billion. Additionally, you've got MTN Nigeria, which is actually, I think, the 18th largest company in Africa by market capitalization. And then third, MTN Nigeria is at $10.4 billion. And then you've got Airtel Africa ranked third with about $6.9 billion. US dollars. As you can see, there's quite, one of the things that's always quite sticks out to me and presents a potential opportunity is how you've got quite a few banks, financial institutions, and I wrote about this in one of my newsletters about how the fintech ecosystem is largely, and we're going to speak about this later, is largely kind of looking to upscale and ultimately disrupt this industry. So you've got Zenith Bank, you've got Guarantee Trust Holdings Company, you've got FBN Holdings, you've got Stanbic IBTC Holdings, all major financial players in Nigeria that kind of make up the rest of the major companies by market capitalization in Nigeria. So speaking of the stock market structure, there was a recent, there was a financial economist and he's a professor of capital markets at the Nasarawa State University, Kefi, Uche Uwolake, who said that the federal government needs to partially privatize government assets such as the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, the NNPC, through the Nigerian Stock Exchange in order to create liquidity and enhance market capitalization. I think that's a quite impressive point because liquidity becomes a very, very big issue, kind of especially when you look at kind of potential exit opportunities for some of the startups and private companies. As we know, the most natural ways, the main options investors are provided with in terms of exit opportunities for startups are IPOs, so initial public offerings, which is when you then launch onto a stock exchange, and then mergers and acquisitions. So outside of that, there's not much that can be provided, and that liquidity becomes very important, especially if you want to encourage people to participate in buying shares and participating on the public markets. And then private markets. So if we look here at the private markets, this is the funding secured by Nigerian startups in 2021, and it breaks it down by particular sectors. So if we just quickly run through fintech, and this is a trend that still follows into 2022. Fintech was the most popular sector in Nigeria. In this particular graphic, in this particular example, it accounts for 59.4% of all the funded startups. And I think about 44.1 of funded startups, 71 of them raised a combined just over $500 million. So, and the majority of the biggest rounds in terms of private investments took place in the fintech space. But then if you look, you've got beyond fintech, we've got the e-commerce sector, which took home $135 million, which is 14.9%. Then energy took home 65.2, which is 7.2. EdTech, which is quite an interesting space, contributed 55.9, which is 6.2. And then e-health, transport, and agritech. And then what kind of some of the remaining very, very interesting context as well. I really appreciate agritech as well. Shout out to the brothers at Relief. I think they've raised an impressive round recently as well, and they're doing really great work in the agritech space. I'm actually going to put some information on them below so that you can reference them, but they're doing some really cool stuff as well. Yeah, according to TechPoint Nigerians, the investments in this space has grown quite significantly, right? So you had foreign investments in Nigerian startups were 156 million in 2018, then 357 million in 2019, so more than doubling, and then 858 million in 2020, and then $935.4 million in 2021. And I think from the 2022, it just eclipsed the billion. So there's been still kind of like, despite market conditions, there's been a lot of interest into Nigeria's startup ecosystem, particularly the fintech space, but all other spaces and sectors are being impacted by this as well. So there seems to be quite a lot of capital going towards this. And I think when you look at kind of like, especially how the internet is enabling people to build for the world, and you've got such a young population that are kind of like digitally native by virtue of their age, it provides quite an interesting value proposition for investors who are looking to kind of allocate capital. My mango juice finished like here, so I then had to like top up the rest with orange juice. It's quite nice, I must admit. But yeah, I think one of the major events that took place, and most recently in the Nigerian startup ecosystem, was the acquisition of Paystack by Stripe in 2020 for $200 million. So that was a great exit opportunity for the team over at Paystack, and really represent kind of like Stripe's probably one of the most premier kind of private companies globally. So them paying attention to the ecosystem was really a bonus for the space, and a nice nod of global approval for what's happening there. And while there were also a number of impressive funding rounds, namely in terms of the Nigerian startup ecosystem, namely Flutterwave's $170 million raise, which was the biggest round of the year, on the continent. Then you have Trade Depot, which added $110 million US. Move, that's spelled MOOVE, had a $63.2 million raise, and Daystar Power 62, Fair Money $42 million, and Metro Africa Express $31 million, and 54Gene. They're really impressive, really impressive startup. I'm going to put some information on them below. They raised $25 million. One of the things that I think it speaks to the liquidity point that was mentioned before is this idea that a lot of the funding is being provided at the very early rounds, particularly pre-seed and seed. So if you look at this, if you reference this picture, you'll see that 44% of the funding rounds that took place in 2021 in the Nigerian startup ecosystem actually took place at a pre-seed round. And then from a seed perspective, it was 38.5%, which were 35 of the startups. And then if you look at pre-series A and also series A, it drops quite substantially. Obviously pre-series A 4.4, and then series A 12.1, and then series B goes to 8.8, and then series C there was only 1. In order for the investment landscape from a private markets perspective to become more attractive, that will have to increase. So, you'll have to see a lot more kind of exit opportunities, especially kind of like later stage funding rounds that will provide a signal to investors the opportunity that they will have a return on their capital, and they will be able to liquidate it at certain points in the future as well. That's also a point that, is really important for the Nigerian and also the African startup ecosystem. I've got a few notes here, so I'll quickly run through them. I think in conclusion, the future of Nigeria largely depends on its ability to leverage its economic advantages. By virtue of economic advantages, we've got here its human capital. So Nigeria is endowed with a large youthful population. If the Nigerian government is able to find ways to effectively engage this population, it will be provided with a workforce that ultimately will be beneficial not just for itself but also for the rest of the world, especially when we look at kind of global trends. And we're seeing that a lot of kind of the more developed nations are having a lot more aging populations. I think there's even a statistic that says by the time we reach, I think it's by 2050, 40% of people under the age of 25 will be in Africa. So a large, is it 20? I don't know. There's a statistic. I'm going to see if I can get it for you guys. But basically, it just points to the fact that Nigeria's Africa will have a youthful population that will not only benefit itself but also benefit the global economy. Economic, and also building a viable environment around this youthful population in terms of access to quality healthcare, digital infrastructure. We're seeing the introduction of Starlink in Africa and Nigeria, and how that's kind of providing people access to internet across the continent, which is really helpful. And then we're also looking at kind of the improvement in education, helping people become ready for a digitally native world in terms of the digital revolution, but also just provision of kind of like the more under-resourced and more provision of the underutilized resources that Nigeria has. So obviously arable land, agriculture is a huge component of the global supply chain that Africa and Nigeria can also play a substantial part in. So there's a lot of considerations, and I think ultimately, like Chinua Achebe said in his short piece, The Trouble of Nigeria, is that fundamentally it comes down to leadership. If the Nigerian leaders are able to create a solid vision and a solid plan of development, I'm sure it will provide a catalyst of its burgeoning youth population that want to work, that want to be provided with opportunity and contribute to the global economy. So yeah, when we look at the future of Nigeria, I think there's a lot that we can be hopeful about. The Nigerian economy will, obviously by virtue of its size, just continue to grow. But I think that economic growth can be sped up by a real focus and an intentional development plan for the youthful population that Nigeria has been endowed with. And by virtue of that, creating the ecosystem and environment where that youthful population can thrive. So with an added emphasis on an improved healthcare system, education, digital infrastructure, physical infrastructure, will provide Nigeria with the basis in which it can thrive and develop. And I think a lot of the emerging technologies that we're seeing kind of like globally be introduced will also, by virtue of the fact that Nigeria is involved in, Nigerians who have access to the internet are involved in a digital world, will also penetrate and be of use in Nigeria. I speak to a lot of people in the space, investing in the space, and also people building in the space. the Nigerian startup ecosystem, and there's a lot to be bullish about. But I think the main point of contention will be favorable political environments that will encourage not only foreign direct investment, but encourage people to actually stay and build. A large swathe of Nigeria's young populations are feeling disenfranchised and disillusioned with the current political regimes, and you've got the proliferation of other parties and individuals coming to the scene. So that could be helpful. So I think that will be really, really helpful for the development of Nigeria, I think. So that's Nigeria done. Tune in next week where we're going to be running through Kenya. I'm going to be doing literally the same thing, providing you an understanding, just a quick 101, quick understanding of the investment landscape in Kenya. Hope you guys have enjoyed the video. Please comment, like, subscribe, share with a friend that you think is interested in just the startup scene, fintech, Africa. I think I'm going to start doubling down on these videos because I really enjoy it. It's a space that, I like to participate in, and I hopefully by God's grace want to participate in more. Yeah, that's me. Peace.